In the years since its inception, the Ace Attorney series, also known as Gyakuten Saiban in Japan, has managed to maintain a significant level of overall quality. Despite the highs and lows that its birth company Capcom has gone through, Ace Attorney was one of several Capcom franchises that managed to stray away from the many pitfalls present in the unofficial 7th console generation, and has managed to maintain a reputation for great storytelling and engaging gameplay. While the objection-shouting main protagonist, Phoenix Wright, is the more recognizable forerunner of the series, I'd like to take the time to shine the spotlight on one of the newer but arguably less appreciated main cast members, Apollo Justice, and more specifically his debut game, Ace Attorney 4. As a note to longtime series fans, I get to play past Apollo Justice. I've not played Ace Attorney 5 or 6, even though I plan to soon, nor have I played the second Miles Edgeworth game. So while I'm kind of late to the party, the following presented opinions are those of someone who has played up to the point of Ace Attorney 4 and feels that the game doesn't quite get the love it deserves. Also, major spoiler warning now, I may touch on each of these games' cases to some degree, so if you don't want to have this game spoiled for you, stop watching now. You've been fairly warned. Anyways, let's give them justice! While I could talk at length about the way that each of the game's 4 cases ends up flawlessly tying all the little details together, and how much I enjoyed using Apollo's ability to observe nervous tics to find new ways to get your cross-examinees to reveal their dirty little secrets, I'd actually like to talk more about what I believe to be Ace Attorney 4's strongest point, and that's the way in which it switched protagonists. From the get-go, you are instead put into the shoes of a rookie defense attorney known as Apollo Justice. All you are told is that it's your first case, your mentor is a man named Christoph Gavin, and your defendant is none other than the famous Phoenix Wright himself, and he's been accused of murder. You soon find out that it's been roughly 7 years since the end of the 3rd Ace Attorney game. Phoenix has been disbarred due to a case in which he presented forged evidence apparently, and has spent his time since then being a bit of a recluse, taking care of his daughter, who now suddenly exists, and playing piano and poker at a local bar. Not the blue suits, sharp-dressed defense we used to know. Though seemingly defeated and washed up, in a shocking twist of fate, Apollo discovers the truth behind the murder case and reveals that his current mentor, Christoph Gavin, was actually the murderer the whole time, and sought out to frame Phoenix for devilish reasons the player discovers later. While Apollo now isn't really sure what to think about Phoenix, he accepts a job offer to work for the talent agency his daughter Trucy Wright runs, and ends up taking cases under the elusive but guiding eyes of Phoenix the whole time. Though it's a bit of a change, the way the game tells the story is very well thought out, I think. It draws the player in with familiar gameplay. The way court cases and cross-examination work is nearly identical to the previous games in the series, but most importantly, it keeps the player interested from the moment the game begins because it begs the question, what the hell happened to Phoenix Wright? Assuming the player has played the first 3 games in the series, which honestly if you're at Ace Attorney 4 that should be a requirement really. I don't think it'll have the same impact if you just start there. That means that the player has spent a significant amount of time in the role of Phoenix, solving case after case and overcoming any strange and mysterious trial he comes across, including matters of life, death, and, well, even life after death. So naturally, seeing your beloved main character in such a rundown and estranged state is enough to keep the player engaged. At least it was enough for me to stay engaged. Each case also serves as a means of revealing a little more about Phoenix as you play through. Sure, each case is decently written in its own right, but playing through just to get those little tidbits of what happened to our favorite old hero makes it all worth it. And finally, in the game's 4th and final case, the player is rewarded with a huge interconnecting web of evidence and introspection that reveals just what Phoenix has been up to for the past 7 years and what the true nature of his disbarment was. It's truly a rewarding experience that does pay off heavily in the end with one of the best endings to any case in the series, in my opinion. Now, I understand why many fans of the series aren't exactly a fan of Apollo Justice, and that's because while I've been singing its praises so far, I can't really go on to my main topic without acknowledging the fact that this game really does kind of throw Apollo on the back burner. Sure, he's kind of a neat new protagonist, and you know, you're still doing familiar things, just running around with Trucy instead of Mia or someone else tied along to your side, like with Phoenix. But Apollo really does get the short end of the stick here. He is kind of just the new guy and doesn't get fleshed out much more beyond the fact that you eventually learn how he's connected to all of this. But the story really is about Phoenix, and I can understand why not everyone is a fan of the game because of that. That aside, though, that's why I chose to talk about the topic of protagonist switching, and why I feel it's actually done pretty decently in this game, despite the fact that Apollo doesn't get fleshed out until games in the future, at least as far as I know. The reason I think protagonist switching is worth mentioning, especially in relation to Ace Attorney, is because oftentimes in video games, that's a very hard thing to do. Consumer reactions to those types of risks are never easily predicted. On one end, a developer can end up with something like Metal Gear Solid 2, a game that, despite its greatness and universal critical acclaim, managed to pull off one of the most controversial protagonist switch in all video games at the time of its release anyways, and yet still remains a fan favorite. Or even something like Pokemon Gold and Silver, where your final challenge as the main player, a challenge even greater than that of the traditional final battles in the Elite Four, is to battle your old self, or just simply put, Red, the protagonist of the first Pokemon games, which was always really cool. You know, you go through the entire game, then you go revisit the old areas that you were all familiar with, and then you essentially fight yourself. On the flip side, though, if you take this kind of risk, you could end up with something questionable, like Final Fantasy XIII-2, the sequel to an already controversial game that most fans still aren't sure that they know how to make sense of. Or you could just get something that's plain awful, like Tales of Symphonia 2. That game really sucks. A game that not only ruins many of the beloved and established characters its predecessor created, but also just falls short in that its new protagonists are very poorly written and very two-dimensional, and are just very unlikable. If you don't get the point here, I really don't like Tales of Symphonia Dawn of the New World. That game's awful. I've beaten it all the way through once before, so I know what I'm talking about. But that's why I think Apollo Justice is so important and deserves more recognition. With examples like Tales of Symphonia 2 and Metal Gear Solid 2, though contrasting, both of those games are just the first follow-ups to each series. Yeah, I know Metal Gear has the older MSX games and the NES ports, but Solid really was the game, or at least the shoot-off in the series that brought the series all the way to the forefront and made it what it is now. And also, yeah, I know the Tales series is long-running. Symphonia 2 might as well be compared to, Final Fantasy 13-2 or even 10-2. It's a spin-off to a mainline game in the series, but a very popular one nonetheless. Anyways, Phoenix Wright gave the player 3 whole games of content and main character establishment, so that by the time they reached the 4th game, the plot twist of changing protagonists was that much more risky and had the potential to lose a lot more longtime fans in the series. Thankfully, Ace Attorney 4 gracefully dodges any of those tricky protagonist switching pitfalls and presents a new protagonist, whose backstory is told in tandem to the main overarching plot of finding out what happened to Phoenix, and also manages to make Phoenix all the more interesting in the way that he's now characterized. Much like playing as Raiden in Metal Gear Solid 2 and watching Snake just go around and do cool stuff in the background under the guise of Pliskin, while you barely struggle to make it out of the big shell alive, you see Phoenix here and there showing up at just the right times, going off on secret missions to do whatever the hell he wants to, while Apollo has to hit the courtroom and do the wet work and create your own new viewpoints and positive connections to the new main character. And that's the strength of a good protagonist switch, really. Not only does the perspective change make you wish you were playing as the original protagonist, because seeing them do cool stuff from the outside is just as awe-inspiring, because not only are they cool, but you're thinking, man, that used to be me, or that could be me, but it's not. And then realizing that the new main character in a similar but unique set of abilities is potentially just as interesting as the original veteran protagonist is also a feeling that's just as satisfying. I'm excited to see how Apollo progresses in future games, since I've heard Ace Attorney 5 and 6 are actually both pretty interesting and do a much better job of bringing his character out and making him a more unique protagonist. But I really enjoy what's here in Ace Attorney 4, and I like what they did despite it not being perfect. I think it's definitely a good example of why protagonist switching is an interesting storytelling mechanic. When done right, it can keep the player engaged and give you different perspectives that you may not have had before. Or if done wrong, you'll just get Tales of Symphonia 2. Anyway, now all that's left is to wait for Apollo Justice Rising Revengeance. Where's that game at? You've been watching Clintellivision. Thanks for stopping by.